Peterson Institute of International Economics in Washington, D.C. I said he's a very special guest speaker. What is special about him is that he devoted almost his lifetime to research on North Korea and the Korean Peninsula in general. Needless to say, he is the leading authority among American economists who are working on the North Korea or on Korea. He wrote numerous books and articles on this area, and he is a very valuable person, and we appreciate very much on his efforts paid to Korea. As you know very well, at the moment, North Korea confronts a number of very difficult issues and some overarching issues. And we still don't know how to resolve these kind of difficulties. Well, the most important issue is, of course, nuclear issue, I guess. We still don't know how to get out of this mess. Another interesting issue that is rising at the moment is the so-called power shifting in a kind of dynastic style from father to son. I'm not an expert on North Korea, but I think this question is important because we wonder whether this power shift can ultimately lead to a regime change. Well, Dr. Noland was here several years ago, I guess in 2004, last time. When he was here, he extensively explored the possibility of regime change in the North Korea. On the alternative scenarios, he made some very positive analysis, in fact. But between then and now, nothing seems to have changed much. Well, while the great attention has been paid to this nuclear issue and regime change issue, they paid very little attention to underlying social and economic changes ongoing in North Korea. Well, Dr. Noland has written a book recently, just because of that, I think. The title of the book is Witness to Transformation. Witness to Transformation. Refugee Insight into North Korea. I think this book is very timely and very relevant at the moment. Well, Dr. Noland is going to give us a talk today on markets and economic changes that are taking place in the North Korea and their potential impact on the stability of North Korean politics, or political stability in North Korea, or political instability of North Korea. I think his talk will be based much on his new book, but I would expect and I hope he will make some comments on many other overriding important issues on North Korea along the line of his speech or through Q&A session. Before closing my remarks, let me add a couple of words on his career. Well, he joined Peterson Institute of International Economics, which is not to large size, but a very concrete institute, leading institute in the world. He joined there in 1985, right? And he has been there since then. And while he was there, well, before that, he worked with the Council of Economic Advisors at the White House as senior economist. And while he working with this Peterson Institute, he has visited a number of universities and research institutes. They include, for example, Yale University and Johns Hopkins University and University of Southern California and Tokyo University and Saitama University for teaching and research. He also visited the Korea Development Institute. How long did you stay there?
About 6 months.
6 months. So he has had ample experience with Korea, and not only Korea, but all Asia. He's also specialist on Japan. He wrote a book with Bella Palazzo on Japan before he died, of course. Well, now I think it's time for me to present Dr. Marcus Noland to you for a very interesting speech. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nam, for that very generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be back here at the Institute for Global Economics and to see so many old friends. I'm always struck by how IGE manages to turn out such a crowd so early in the morning, especially in the morning where it's pouring down rain, and I know that it may have been difficult for many of you to get here, and it is indeed very gratifying. It's indeed gratifying that you made it out this morning. It's also a bit daunting to see people who were in effect my teachers about North Korea sitting here in the audience. So I'm going to have to try very hard, to do a good job. As Dr. Nam said, what I'm going to talk about today is largely derived from a book that I wrote with Stephen Haggard of the University of California at San Diego that came out earlier this year called Witness the Transformation, Refugee Insights into North Korea. The book is based on 2 surveys of refugees, and in the interest of simple just getting through the talk, I'm going to refer to these people as refugees, though I think technically speaking, the people who are now here in South Korea are not refugees. But just in the interest of a smooth talk, I will call this group of people refugees. The first survey was done in 2005 in China. We surveyed more than 1,600 people. The problem with the survey done in China was it was done surreptitiously. The people we were interviewing were in effect illegal aliens, and the quality of the survey did not meet kind of normal contemporary social science standards. I mean, that was simply the way it was because of the circumstances under which we conducted the survey. So then we conducted a second survey in November of 2008 here in South Korea. And under the much more secure legal conditions here in South Korea, we were able to administer a much longer and more nuanced questionnaire. And it was gratifying for us to see that when we did the second survey here in South Korea, the results that we obtained largely lined up with the earlier study done in China, and in fact the 2 surveys then reinforce each other. Most of the specific results I'll show in these slides are actually derived from that second survey done here in South Korea. The refugees are of interest for 2 reasons. The first is that they constitute a first-order humanitarian problem in and of themselves. So we're interested in the refugees as human beings. The second reason for interest is the insight into conditions in North Korea which they can provide. So my talk is going to be divided into 3 parts. The first part, I'll talk a bit about the refugees themselves. Then I'll spend more of the talk talking about what they can tell us about North Korea. And then finally, being from the Peterson Institute and being encouraged to offer policy prescriptions, I'll ask the question, well, what is to be done? And go into policy. We did these two surveys. The basic demographics of the sample are a little different in the two surveys. In the China survey, the respondents were roughly equally men and women. In the survey here in South Korea, women predominated, as they do predominate in the North Korean or refugee, however you want to call it, defector population that is now settled here in South Korea. The age span ranged from adolescents to older people, but the bulk of the respondents in both surveys were in their peak working ages of their 30s or their 40s. Geographically, they were from all provinces and regions in North Korea, including the capital city Pyongyang, though the northeastern provinces of North and South Hamgyong predominate, as they do in the general refugee community. Educational attainment was one place where the two surveys diverged. In the survey done here in South Korea, the median respondent had a high school education. That was not the case for the survey done in China. And one of the basic methodological issues or problems we face in this work is that we're asking people questions and we have to assume that they're telling the truth, that their memories are correct and they're not lying to us. Educational attainment is one area which, if you expected them to lie, you would expect them to exaggerate their educational credentials. And so it's really striking that in the China survey, so many of the respondents answered that they had very, very low levels of education, which belie North Korean claims about the educational attainment of the regime. Finally, not only do we have information about the people themselves, we have information about their fathers. And what is striking when you look at this data is how little intergenerational socioeconomic mobility there appears to be in North Korea. If your father was a farmer, you're a farmer. If your father was a laborer, you're a laborer, and so on. There's a bit of upward drift in educational attainment. People, on the whole, tend to be a little better educated than their parents, but in terms of socioeconomic mobility or occupational mobility, it's actually very slight. One of the things we asked the refugees in both surveys is, why did you leave North Korea? In the China survey, they overwhelmingly cited economic motivations, and in the survey done in South Korea, economic motivations, in that blue box, it's the majority. But more than a quarter of the sample cited political reasons for leaving North Korea. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. When we did the China survey, one of our colleagues, collaborators in that survey, was a psychologist. And so a number of the questions on that survey had to do with the psychological or mental health status of the respondents. And I think it's fair to say that in a clinical setting, probably half or more of the people that we interviewed in a clinical setting would be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress syndrome. And indeed, here in South Korea, there is a clinical literature being done by psychologists and medical doctors, which is documenting high levels of mental health problems among this population. When we analyze the data statistically, it appears that these problems relate both to their experiences in North Korea and their experiences in China, where most of these people transit on their way to South Korea. In North Korea, what we find is the famine of the 1990s continues to have a profound effect on the society. About a third of our respondents indicated that they had either had a family member die or had become separated from family during the famine period. And one of the things we found that was surprising to us was a very high share of the respondents in both surveys indicated that when they were in North Korea, they were unaware of the international food aid effort. Now, among the people that were aware, the vast majority believed that they were not personally beneficiaries, that most of the food went to the army or went to high government officials. Now, this doesn't prove that this is the case, but I'm simply reporting what the respondents themselves believed. And it turns out that being in the category of people who knew about the food aid program but believed that they were not themselves beneficiaries was a profoundly demoralizing experience. These people feel as though they were abandoned at their time of need, and that has a profound impact on their psychological status, even greater, it appears, in statistical terms than incarceration in the prison system, which I will address in a moment. The other reason the refugees are of interest, of course, is for the insights or the window that they can provide into North Korea in this kind of information constrained environment. And I'll quickly sketch out three themes of the book. The first are the social and economic changes to which the refugees attest. One of the questions, we don't have a proper panel. We can't follow individuals within North Korea over time. But what we can do is take the sample of respondents we have and stratify them by the time at which they left North Korea. So for example, in this chart, we've broken the sample into three parts, depending on when people left North Korea. The famine period, which we defined from 1998 earlier, the post-famine period from 1999 to 2002, and then the post-reform period from 2003 on. And in this chart, the underlying samples are roughly 1/3. The samples are roughly equal size across each of those. So we asked them, what is the easiest way to make money in North Korea? And they said, go for the green. They said going into business is the easiest way to make money in North Korea. Sadly, working hard at your assigned task is not much of a way to get ahead in North Korea, and in fact disappears entirely in the most recent period. But what's striking about that panel on the left is the red box. That's engaged in corrupt or criminal activities. And as you can see, corruption is a growth industry in North Korea. We then asked them, what is the best way to get ahead in North Korea? And going into business, the green is a growing part. The military is increasingly not seen as a way to get ahead, as you can see. When I present this information in Washington, people say, well, wait a minute. North Korea has military-first politics. I say, yes, military-first politics may be very good if you're a general, but it appears that military-first politics are not regarded as a very good way to get ahead if you're a conscript. But what's striking about that panel on the right-hand side is how big the blue box is. And that's the state and the party. So the state and the party are still seen as the way to get ahead. And indeed, these two results are linked. When we broke up the sample and we simply looked at people who reported that their occupation had been working for the state or working in party offices in North Korea, they report increased amounts of corruption among their colleagues. And interestingly, they also report increased amount of time in their offices devoted to ideological indoctrination. It appears that the central authorities understand the fraying control they have over this system, and they are trying to reinforce the ideological fidelity of the state and party cadre. But keep in mind this basic result: corruption as a growth industry and the state remaining the basic way of getting ahead. When you do research, you go into it with a certain number of ideas or hypotheses in mind. But then there are things that you discover in the process of doing research that you had not anticipated. And one of the things we find that we did not anticipate was the degree of criminalization of economic activity. Legal code changes undertaken in North Korea have greatly broadened the range of economic crimes, and roughly speaking, today, I think it would be fair to say that as an approximation, a typical non-elite North Korean probably runs afoul of one of these rules or regulations in their everyday behavior, making everyone, in some sense, a criminal. Now, the police are given extraordinary discretion with respect to whom to arrest and detain, and the conditions in detention are horrific. This creates a perfect instrument for extortion, because the police can basically come and grab you, put you into a facility where you know put you and your family into a facility where you know abuses are rampant. And as a consequence, you will be eager to pay bribes to keep yourself and your family from being entangled in such a system. In short, the penal system has gone from its traditional role of enforcing political repression to a broader role of acting as a platform for economic predation on the population. So as you see in this chart, people involved in the market are arrested at a 50% higher rate than their peer. When they're arrested, we ask them, did you receive any kind of formal proceeding or trial before being incarcerated? And only 12% said they received any formal proceeding or trial. Then, in the case of North Korea, there are really four classes of penal institutions. There are misdemeanor jails, there are felony prisons, there's the political prison system, and then coming out of the famine experience of the 1990s, there's now a new form of detention facility, which has actually been codified in the legal code, called labor training centers, where many of these economic criminals are housed. So we would expect, going from the labor training center to the jail, to the prison, to the political prison, an escalation of abuse. And in fact, we observe an escalation of abuse. But what's really striking to us is how mild that escalation is, especially when you take into account that the periods of detention or incarceration are shorter in the labor training centers and the jails than they are in the political gulag. So when you look at a person incarcerated for a typical length of a period of months in one of these labor training centers, the likelihood of them seeing abuse is really very, very high. So these abuses within the system appear to be pervasive and not limited only to the worst of the political prisons. Which brings us to the third theme of the book. What are the political implications of all of this? People increasingly have access to foreign media, and they are increasingly consuming it. Now, I'm an American, and we, in the United States, we had a president. His name was Bill Clinton. I used to work for him. And he was the first president of the United States to be born after the Second World War. He was the first baby boomer president. So when he ran for president, it raised some cultural issues in the American milieu. And in particular, when he was running for president, Mr. Clinton was asked, had he ever smoked marijuana? Now, because there were people who said they saw him when he was a college student smoking marijuana. Now, the response he gave was so ridiculous that I may have trouble actually getting it right. But I think he said something like this. Well, it is true, I smoked marijuana, but I did not inhale the smoke. I smoked, but I did not inhale. So I look at that top chart, and I call that the Bill Clinton chart. I'm having trouble here with this. The part that's red is the people who say they don't have access to foreign news. The part that's blue that says those are the people who say they consumed foreign news. The part that is green, that starts out kind of big on the left-hand side but disappears by the right-hand side, that's the Bill Clinton group. That's the people who said, I had access to foreign news, but I didn't consume. So what you see from that is that not only is consumption of foreign news rising, but the inhibition against consuming it is disappearing, if not disappeared altogether. Why is that important? Turns out that people who consume foreign news are associated with having more negative views or dissenting views of the regime, and it is a regime narrative that is increasingly disbelieved. The narrative that all of North Korea's problems are caused by hostile foreign forces. That's increasingly disbelieved by the population. But the population remains atomized and characterized by low levels of trust. In our survey, we ask a series of questions that could be considered political anthropology. We ask people, when you were in North Korea, among your friends, did you joke about conditions? Did you complain about conditions? Did you joke about the government? Did you complain about the government? Did you joke about Kim Jong-il? Did you complain about Kim Jong-il? Did you know people who were organizing against the government? So you start from just kind of making jokes about the situation to people organizing to overthrow the government. And what's really striking is even among the self-selected group of refugees, people who have voted with their feet, who by definition have negative appraisals of conditions within North Korea, even among this group, relatively low numbers report, in this case, in the case of this particular slide, it's people making jokes about the government. To me, I see this as an indication of still how atomized this population is. So we conclude that, discontent is likely to be widespread, but there appears to be a complete absence of civil society institutions capable of channeling that mass discontent into any kind of constructive political action. This is where the market or the economic issues that I've been discussing and the political issues meet. We find something that we label the market syndrome, and I believe that the state on its own terms is right to fear the market. And that explains the reluctance of the North Korean regime to embrace the economic reforms that would be necessary to rehabilitate the economy. We find that people who are involved in market activities are more likely to report political motives for departure. They are 50% more likely to have been arrested than their peers. They have even more negative views of the regime than the typical refugee, typical person in our sample. And critically, they are more likely to communicate those views to their peers. The market is emerging not only as a mechanism for addressing the material deprivation of the North Korean people, but it is emerging as a semi-autonomous zone of social communication and potentially political organizing. John Everhard, who used to be the United Kingdom's ambassador in Pyongyang, made a habit of going into markets. In principle, he wasn't supposed to, but he's a very charming guy and he speaks beautiful Korean, and he would just go into these markets. And recently somebody asked John, what were they talking about in the market? And he said, Egypt. One last methodological issue, and then I'll talk a bit about policy. Obviously, we've been interviewing refugees. These people, as I said, they voted with their feet. They left the country. They presumably have negative views. And the question is, are these views at all representative of the resident population? And we spend a lot of time and effort in the book trying to get at that question. Ultimately, we cannot completely answer it. There may be unobservable characteristics of these individuals that simply make them different, and their views may not be representative. But to the extent that we can control for every kind of identifiable characteristic, whether it be a demographic characteristic, their age, their gender, their educational attainment, their previous employment, their father's previous employment, or life experience, did you receive aid, did you not receive aid, and so on. To the extent that we can control how much time did you spend in China, how much time have you spent in South Korea, maybe your views were affected by the amount of time you spent here. To the extent we try to control statistically for every single characteristic that we can observe. And when we do that, we find in general, one cannot reject the proposition that their views are indeed representative of the remaining resident population of North Korea. On what I would describe as the factual questions, we were interested in a lot in household economics, and so we asked them lots of questions along the lines of, what share of your household income came from employment at the state-owned enterprise? What share of your household income came from unregulated market activities? Those kind of factual issues. The difference is when we do these counterfactual projections onto the remaining resident population appear to be very slight. when we ask opinion questions, what do you think of the Kim Jong-il regime? Do you think things are getting better? Things of that sort. There may be more room for more difference. It appears that we may have, in fact, oversampled groups or people with experiences that would lend them to have negative appraisals of the regime. But what I simply show two examples on this slide. There are many examples in the book in which we take, the blue is what we get in our sample. The yellow is what we project for the national population, and those red bars are the 95% confidence intervals. And as you can see, what we obtain, that blue bar for the group itself, always falls within the 95% confidence intervals in all these projections. So we conclude that, obviously there is room for error in this work, but we think that what we are portraying is a reasonable portrayal of at least some significant share of the North Korean population and deserves to be taken seriously. So what is to be done? Well, the book is based on refugee interviews, so refugees are important to us, but they simply represent the tip of the iceberg. They're only the visible part. 90% of the North Korean human rights problem is below the surface, involving the people who remain in North Korea. So just as an illustration, we go into very great detail in the book, but just as an illustration, we divide the policies up into policies to address the needs of the resident population, policies to address the needs of refugees. We have what we call direct policies that involve negotiating with the North Korean government, sort of traditional diplomacy, require acquiescence or cooperation by the North Korean government. And then we have what we call indirect policies, which are policies that can be done unilaterally, that don't require any kind of assent by the North Korean government. So, for example, in terms of the resident population, we think information is very important. Ultimately, and I'm going to give you a prelude of the bottom line that I'm going to come to in a minute, but we don't think there's a lot we can do from the outside to change the fundamental nature of the North Korean political regime. However, what we can do is start to build in North Korea mechanisms for people to exert greater pressure on the regime to be accountable. The real tragedy of North Korea is that the regime has an almost untrammeled capacity for inflicting misery on its own population. And what we want to do is to begin to constrain that regime to act in a more responsible and accountable manner. Information and markets are two mechanisms that we can begin to constrain the regime. And then from the standpoint of outsiders, considering investing in North Korea, we might want to consider labor standards to make sure that the investors who go into North Korea are acting in a constructive way and not simply exploiting what amounts to virtual slave labor. In terms of the refugees, in the interest of time and space, I only listed some policies for the United States and China, but obviously South Korea is key. What we would argue for, and what we argue for in the book, is what we call engagement with our eyes open. And that is to say, we think that it is important to engage with North Korea, but we also think it's very important not to have any delusions about the nature of the North Korean regime or what that engagement may accomplish. In terms of economics, we see a hierarchy of forms of engagement, starting with humanitarian aid, going through development assistance, and ultimately commercial engagement. The last one, commercial engagement, will be absolutely critical. The financial and technical needs for rehabilitating the North Korean economy are so vast that you will not be able to do it working only through public sector institutions. It's going to need private sector involvement. And so figuring out the best way to move forward on commercial engagement is a critical issue. So where does this leave us? As Dr. Nam mentioned, North Korea faces a looming succession. We believe that discontent is widespread, but as I mentioned earlier, there's an absence of civil society institutions, or at least we don't see civil society institutions capable of channeling that mass discontent. There's no solidarity trade union that we can see. There's no Catholic Church. There's no civic forum. There's not even the role that Cardinal Sin played in the Philippines of legitimating the dissent and the People's Power Revolution against the Marcos regime. We see a complete absence of these institutions. Maybe they're there and they're under the surface. I hope they are, but we don't see them. So rather than any kind of organized opposition to the regime, what we see is what the sociologist James C. Scott described in another context as everyday forms of resistance. People, in effect, dropping out of the system, simply trying to organize their lives in ways that do not involve high levels of entanglement with the state. Though, as I mentioned earlier, the state is very intimately involved in people's lives through the criminal and penal system. In this sense, we see the market as a zone of personal autonomy and freedom, and as outsiders, we should be acting to try to strengthen the market as an institution in North Korea, not only to address the material needs of the North Korean people, but to address broader social and humanitarian concerns as well. Ultimately, to use a Marxian formulation, we want to intensify the contradictions. We want to constrain what is effectively an unaccountable regime. And as I said earlier, to me, that is the great tragedy of North Korea, is that the political regime effectively has no accountability, and it can impose the worst sorts of misery on its people with little capacity or mechanism within the system to correct those sorts of behaviors. I'd like to thank you for your attention and mention as a kind of commercial on my way out that not only have Haggard and I written this book, but we now have a blog, North Korea Witness to Transformation blog, and there's the address. It's on the Peterson Institute website, and we post a variety of sorts of a commentary on a daily basis on this blog, and I would urge you or to encourage you to take a look at it, add your comments as you would like. I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the question and answer period in which we can discuss a broader range of issues as well as the ones that I've discussed thus far. Thank you.
Thank you for your detailed presentation on the North Korean situation. I think my question is a little bit different from your specific area of North Korean knowledge. What I'm concerning is many Koreans view China think North Korea as a buffer zone of military aggression from United States and South Korea. So they do not really want unification of Korean Peninsula. Under these circumstances and the perspectives, how does South Korean government persuade China in terms of even if unification of Korea does not damage Chinese security? I would like to have your opinion about that.
Well, that's obviously a huge and important question. I believe that your fundamental premise is correct, that China prefers a divided Korean peninsula to a unified Korean peninsula. It likes having a fraternally allied socialist buffer state on its border. I believe beyond that China, or at least some elements in China, find North Korea to be a useful pawn in China's rivalry with the United States and India. You can have nuclear or missile cooperation with, say, Pakistan or Iran through North Korea. And so China does not have to get directly involved. Nevertheless, it creates heartburn for the United States and for India, its two biggest geopolitical rivals. So I believe that the Chinese preference would be to keep North Korea around, and that is why China acts in ways that are very supportive of North Korea in terms of things like United Nations sanctions and so on. So what can South Korea do? Well, it seems to me that the argument that South Korea has to make is that, and it's the same argument I think frankly the United States could make, but South Korea could probably make it better, which is that North Korea has the potential of really destabilizing Northeast Asia. Because of North Korean nuclear activities, that puts pressure on both puts pressure on both South Korea and Japan to strengthen their alliances with the United States and potentially develop nuclear capabilities of their own, something that is not in China's interest. And if Japan and South Korea can develop nuclear capability, then why not Taiwan as well? And again, this is not in China's interest. So North Korea has the potential of not only strengthening this network of U.S. alliances in Northeast Asia, but setting off a very real arms race among a set of wealthy, technologically advanced countries. And that's not in China's interest. My own experience in China is that decision-making is very stovepiped within China, and there is a strong generational component. So there are people who are essentially of my father's generation, who personally experienced the Korean War, who have some kind of personal or ideological affinity for North Korea, and they really do want to back the North Koreans. And then there are people who are essentially my age or younger, many of whom had bad experiences themselves during the Cultural Revolution period. And they look at this cult of personality and hereditary succession in North Korea with complete derision. And for them, they could accept a unification of the peninsula on South Korean terms. They say that we have a perfectly prosperous and good relationship with South Korea. That's not an issue. The issue is the disposition of American troops. And if you could work out a deal with the Chinese about how you handle an American troop presence after unification, or the removal of American troops after unification, then I think there is a rising constituency within China that would accept that outcome. But that rising constituency is not the constituency in power today. And so today, I expect China to continue its policy of effectively propping up North Korea.
I thank you, Professor Noland, for this very valuable study. Of course, scientific content is evident because you rely to two different samples, and there is a scientific evidence in order to do this. And also for the further qualification of the validity of the sample as a proxy for the larger sample. Considering this point, I would be very interested whether is there anything in your analysis concerning the concept of an evaluation of self-reliance. This is, in my opinion, a very important part of the perception by the North Korean population of the power, of the necessity to accept the power decisions. Is there anything we show that self-reliance as a good thing remains in the mind of the refugees as a positive element, even when they are out of the country? Self-reliance is a concept which is limited to the economic, but sometimes arising in the political field. And it's difficult to find the border between the two concepts. In Neo-Latin languages, we use the word autarky, which means two things. It means exact command to yourself, but means also be content with your necessity, try to find out your necessity, and self-reliance is a little bit different. Nevertheless, anything related to this concept in the survey?
That we did not ask them about their views about Juche. But we did ask them about, in the China survey, we asked them, or in both surveys, we asked them about their hopes for the Korean Peninsula. And what we found, and we asked it in three ways. We asked, what is your preferred state of the Korean Peninsula today? What was your preferred state when you were in North Korea? And what is your projection or your assessment of what your friends and family wanted for the Korean Peninsula when you were in North Korea? And the answers that we get when we ask the question those three ways are basically consistent. There's overwhelming sentiment for unification. There is very little sentiment for some kind of third way in which North Korea would remain an independent state, but have a non-Kim Il-sungist political regime. And as you could well imagine with this population, there's virtually no sentiment for maintenance of the status quo. So that doesn't address the issue of self-reliance directly, but it suggests that the people that we interviewed did not have a strong attachment to either the current national ideology or the maintenance of North Korea as an independent state.
Thank you, Mark, for very interesting reports on the perplexing, increasingly perplexed situation in North Korea. I have three questions. Let me begin with the easiest one, which you don't have to answer. Have you ever smoked marijuana? Then we can move on to the second question. You have noticed, of course, that this Lee Myung-bak government in South Korea has adopted the policy of discontinuing the so-called sunshine policy, curtailing material and humanitarian aid to North Korea, and so on. How do you evaluate this policy against the criteria or policy recommendations that you had? And secondly, you have told us that people increasingly in North Korea are considering market activities as sort of a proxy or expression of political freedom. Now, of course, the North Korean regime, the government would be aware of that significance of market activities by North Korean people. And of course, I assume that they will be responding to that by trying to suppress the marketization or market activities. What does it mean for the future of the North Korean economy and North Korea as a whole? What will be the end game look like down the road?
This fear of the market is a profound difficulty for North Korea, because in order to rehabilitate the economy, they need the market, but they are afraid of the market. That is why ever since 2000, actually it even goes back to the late 1990s, the state has shown this ambivalence. It's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Right now what they're trying to do, or at least this is the way I would characterize what the North Korean regime is trying to do. In the last 6 months or a year, we have seen this opening to China. And what I would say is that basically the way I characterize their attitude is, we want to be prosperous. We want to be modern, we want to be prosperous, but we want to do it on our own terms. So in some other work that I've been doing with Haggard, we have surveyed 300 Chinese enterprises doing business in North Korea. And the first paper from that survey will come out next month. What we find is that a vast bulk of this activity is done by decentralized, profit-seeking enterprises, whatever their particular legal status is in China. But they are undertaking this cross-border exchange on market-conforming terms. They're there to make money. And if they can't make money, they pull out. Okay? What the North Koreans seem to want to do is suppress or eliminate that decentralized, market-conforming forms of exchange and replace it with integration with China, exchange with China, but through mechanisms and entities that are strictly controlled by the government. And I can't say that I'm greatly enthusiastic for this kind of thing. One of the things we find in the survey we've done of Chinese businesses in North Korea is the Chinese do not trust the North Koreans. They regard, remember, these are Chinese responding, they regard the North Koreans as incredibly corrupt. And so, for example, they quite explicitly are afraid of expropriation of assets. And so they are reluctant to invest. They would rather export to North Korea than invest and produce in North Korea. And when they export to North Korea, they literally want the deal to be transacted in China. So they have recourse to whatever dispute resolution systems they have in China. The financing terms are very strict. It's almost cash on the barrelhead. And they want US dollars or Chinese yuan or barter. Those are the three biggest currencies, so to speak, of transaction. So the North Korean regime wants to basically eliminate that kind of activity and channel it through entities that are strictly controlled by the state. And I think this is a basic contradiction for the North Korean regime. I don't see anything really changing as long as Kim Jong-il is alive. I think he's too old and too invested in the system. When he dies, North Korea is going to face a challenge in organizing a government. It'll probably take that government some time to establish enough to consolidate power and have the confidence to start making changes if they are interested in making changes. That's a big question. But even if they were interested, it'll take a while. So I see real change in North Korea to be some years off. So then that goes to the second question. What about South Korean policy? President Kim Dae-jung came into office with the Sunshine Policy, which was explicitly, indeed, that is where the term sunshine comes from. It comes from the Aesop fable of the sun and the wind. The Sunshine Policy in Kim Dae-jung's conception was instrumental. It was aimed at changing or transforming the North Korean regime into a more prosperous and humane regime internally and into a regime that displayed less bellicose external behavior. That conception of engagement as an instrument to encourage the transformation of North Korea in desirable directions, it seems to me that drifted into a really different policy under President Roh Moo-hyun, which was engagement for engagement's sake. It was no longer, engagement was seen as the end in itself, rather than as an instrument to get to a certain goal. And I think that it is understandable that after 10 years of engagement with very little to show for it, the South Korean public wanted greater reciprocity. They wanted the North Koreans to kind of, show that they appreciated what the South Koreans were doing. And I think that one has to see President Lee Myung-bak's election in that context. Now, once he was elected, he did two things that were, in some ways, I get very nervous about commenting on South Korean politics when I'm in South Korea. I'm not a Korean. But it seemed to me that President Lee Myung-bak did two things that were understandable and defensible, but perhaps could be regarded as contradictory, at least by the North Koreans. One was he put on the table this plan, and I don't remember the exact name, but it was the plan to have per capita income at $3,000 in North Korea. So in some ways, he's offering even bigger rewards, more engagement than his predecessors. A big deal, $3,000. At the same time, he disavowed, I think for understandable reasons, he disavowed the commitments that his predecessor had made at the October 2007 summit. And the North Koreans reacted predictably negatively, but for two reasons. Number one, the free ride was over. The South Koreans were now saying, if you want benefits, we're willing to provide you lots of benefits, but you're going to have to do something in return. And secondly, these specific promises are no longer on the table. The North Koreans reacted negatively. I thought they would get over it and that the two countries would start to converge towards, a more constructive relationship. To my surprise, that has not happened. And in another book, and I wish I had it because I would hold it up at this point. It's another book that Haggard and I wrote that just came out last month. It is on exactly this issue of economic statecraft. And we reached the sort of depressing conclusion that neither sanctions nor inducements really seem to work very well with North Korea. That North Korea's behavior is fundamentally driven by North Korean internal political calculations. And in particular now, the succession is a big issue. And the outside world, South Korea, the United States, others, really have a limited ability to affect North Korean behavior. So I don't see any major breakthrough. Given the political situation in the United States, given the political situation in South Korea, given the political situation in North Korea, I don't see any major breakthroughs or changes for several years. Which leads me to your first question, have I ever smoked marijuana? The answer is yes. Unlike President Clinton, I inhaled. But I found two things. Number one, I didn't really enjoy it very much. And secondly, I have a kind of breathing problems. I have problems with allergies and so on. So smoking anything, cigarettes, marijuana, cigars, it creates problems for my nasal passages. And then I became a muckety-muck, and I got a high-level security clearance from the U.S. government. And you know, you can't have a high-level security clearance from the U.S. government if you're going to take drugs. So yes, I did smoke marijuana, but the last time I smoked marijuana was probably about 30 years ago. I think it's exited my system by now. But the other book that I just referred to is called Engaging North Korea, The Role of Economic Statecraft. It is Policy Studies 59 from the East-West Center in Honolulu, Hawaii. And although the publications department at the East-West Center might get upset with me for pointing this out, you can download the PDF of this book for free. I know that getting Western or American books in Seoul can be difficult and expensive. So this one you can get instantaneously for free if you just go to the East-West Center website. Or in fact, there's a link to the book on the Peterson website as well.
Oh, good.
Thank you for your useful and excellent presentation. My name is Lee Sang-Seo, and Lee is my Korean family name. Allow me to ask you one or two simple questions, expecting brief answers. Are there business mafia equivalents exist in North Korea? If so, how influential are they in maintaining the regime and economy? My last question is, would China witness transformation of North Korea without interference, or would China extend extensive influence to North Korea, help keep the regime? If so, to what extent, in your view?
Because we talk about the market in North Korea over the last 15 or 20 years basically developed out of state failure. It was because of the state's inability to provide goods to the people. It was not because of any well thought out, intended top-down reform. The market developed out of state failure. That's one of the reasons why the state has never been comfortable with it. One of the aspects of this way that the market developed is that people who themselves are part of the elite, either in the government or connected to the government, play an important role in the market. So, for example, you will have the wives of National Security Agency agents being important in the market. You have people who are managing public distribution centers for food being involved in the food market. And so when you think about change in North Korea, one of the ways that change is happening is that the elite itself is becoming embroiled or entangled in this market, and that may constrain the government's ability to take action against it. Because when the government takes action against it, it starts hurting its own people. I'll give you a simple example. At the time of the November 2009 currency reform, the North Koreans engaged in this basically currency confiscation. The obvious response was going to be a rush into the black market to get foreign currencies. And indeed, the value of the North Korean won collapsed because everybody was trying to sell won, buy dollars, yuan, anything they could get their hands on. And then the government said, okay, well, we're going to ban foreign currencies. And I thought to myself, and I said in many interviews that day, absolutely no way that can happen. Because the military itself controls so many dollars, there is no way you can ban the use of foreign currency. What, are you going to have agents going to the generals' houses and taking away their money? It's not going to happen. And the government had to back off within about a week. So the way that the market has developed is in this very unregulated, non-transparent way that has created a lot of relationships, which I don't even think the regime itself understood. One of the things that happened in November, the currency reform is at the very end of November, occurred in December, the following month, is some of the prestige projects to build apartment buildings in Pyongyang had to be halted because there was a shortage of cement. Why was there a shortage of cement? Well, the construction firms that were building these apartments were state-owned construction firms, but they were actually procuring supplies in the market. And so when they did the currency reform and the markets collapsed, even the state-owned construction firms couldn't get access to cement. And I think this must have been eye-opening for some people in Pyongyang, that even their own sort of core state institutions had been compromised or infected by this reliance on the market. So I think that there is a kind of business mafia in North Korea, and it will have a profound impact on how the economy is reformed moving forward. In the case of China, China has major stakes in North Korea. China is investing in North Korea. We all know the recent headlines about these cooperation projects. But I got to tell you, to go back to something I said in response to Su Gil-young's question, the Chinese don't trust the North Koreans. The Chinese do not trust the North Korean business environment. And if North Korea could regularize the way that business is conducted in North Korea, there could be very big payoffs, especially in investment. Because investors, not only Chinese investors, but other investors, would be more willing to go into North Korea if they did not have such deep fears of expropriation.
Well, I have maybe two ideal questions. As you know, the number of North Korean refugees into the South Korea are increasing, which amount to about 25,000 people today. But the problem with South Korea is that we cannot identify who is real refugee and who is fake refugee. That is the question, because as you know, in the South Korea, the most post-Korean War generation do not have any ideological difference between North and South. And the number who are leaning to leftist side is increasing over time in the South. So even though the North Korean refugee who is not assimilated into the South Korean societies, there are some kind of bridge between those leftist Korean and North Korea. But this has some big problem for the stability of South Korea in the future, politically. And I don't know how to handle this issue, this problem. And as my second question is that you said China is no longer, or China does not trust in the North Korean political leadership. Even though it's not matter of trust or not, China has still seeking their economic and political leverage into the North Korea. So what is your, I don't know if you have any answer to that, I really appreciate it. Thank you.
I think that there is a problem that North Korea is apparently, from what I understand, using this refugee channel to introduce agents into South Korea. How you identify these agents as they come in, I have absolutely no idea. I mean, it seems to be a real problem, but I don't know what the solution is. One of the things that these agents may be doing is establishing links with groups here in South Korea. And again, I'd be very cautious about my commentary on South Korea because I'm not a Korean, but could be regarded as seditious groups. And again, I mean, that's an obvious issue. The other thing they appear to be doing is trying to intimidate the broader refugee population here and gathering information on them, gathering information on their families back in North Korea, which are then shaken down by the regime. There are reports of the regime very systematically trying to gather and control into camps the relatives of people who've gotten to South Korea, and then demanding that the people here in South Korea send remittances, which then are basically taken by the North Korean regime. That's the story. I don't know how credible it is, but obviously there are real issues involved in the North Koreans' government putting agents through this refugee channel. On the issue of China, I'm not sure that it's an issue of the Chinese don't trust the North Korean leadership. I know that, well, I want to be very clear. What I was saying was Chinese businessmen do not trust North Korea. I mean, they're very afraid when they go in that they will be expropriated or otherwise abused in economic terms. As for the Chinese leadership, I think my guess is that they are not. It's hard for me to imagine the Chinese leadership is very enthusiastic about hereditary succession as a political institution, right? It's a very non-Marxist sort of thing. And so I doubt that I suspect they kind of look askance at the North Korean regime in the same way they probably look askance about the astrology and numerology of the Burmese generals. Nevertheless, they're going to do business with them because they see the maintenance of that regime in North Korea as in their long run interest. And I think the issue, to go back to an earlier question, is that South Korea has to persuade China that there is an alternative future that is not damaging to China's interests, that involves unification of the Korean Peninsula.
The newspaper yesterday says that Kim Jong-il will visit Russia. So this might mean that Kim Jong-il is in a desperate situation to seek assistance from outside. And so I'd like to ask you why. Perhaps your view on Kim's scheduled visit to Russia, and you mentioned that discontent is widespread among North Koreans. So I'd like to know how to mobilize this kind of discontent to train the North Korean system. I think that you paid an overall negative view on North Korea, but will there be any slight possibility to change in that system? Thank you.
I can't remember which one, but he always has some famous line in each of these movies. In one of these movies, he has a line something like, "A man has got to know his limitations." And in my case, anything I say about Kim Jong-il visiting Russia is going to be completely speculative in nature, which was probably less well informed than everyone else in this room. Is it because he's desperate? I don't know. It seems to me that there are two things going on. One is that Russia seems to be trying to create a more assertive diplomacy, not just in the Korean Peninsula, but for example, the Russians have become very active in trying to reach some sort of solution in the situation in Libya. So I think that this should be viewed as part of a more broad Russian attempt to reassert its influence in the world, and specifically to have a somewhat different view than what the Russians would call the West. Okay? So having some meeting between the president of Russia and Kim Jong-il would be consistent with that Russian sort of these Russian developments. On the North Korean side, it could be that he's desperate. It could be that he's just trying to shore up support, that there is this looming succession issue, and that he is trying to get as good a deal as he can for both North Korea and his successor. But as I said, I have no particular knowledge of this situation. Those are just my guesses. On the issue of how to mobilize the Cent, I would say two things. First of all, information is critical. And the more information we can get into North Korea, the better. And I don't necessarily mean propaganda or Kim Jong-il tracks, just news of the world, just unbiased sources of information. I mean, for example, North Korean official news accounts have said virtually nothing about the political revolutions happening in the Middle East. Indeed, we hear these reports that North Korean workers in Libya have been told to stay where you're at, precisely because the North Koreans are concerned about when these workers who have been working in Libya or Egypt or other countries in the Middle East come back to North Korea, what they may say, that they saw and they heard. So information is critical. Second of all, in terms of economic engagement, we want to engage with North Korea, but we also want to support the development. Calling them non-state institutions is probably an exaggeration because of the nature of the North Korean economy. Almost everybody somehow is tied to the state. But we want to support the development of institutions that are not so tightly controlled by the central government. And we wanted to support those institutions because they may act in economically more efficient ways than institutions that are more tightly controlled by the government. And also because one wants to encourage the development of alternative sources of power, whether it be economic power through wealth or prestige or whatever, to the central government. And so it seems to me that in terms of encouraging the mobilization of the North Korean people, information and the encouragement of, or the expansion of kinds of zones of personal and institutional autonomy, not controlled by the state, is the best way to move forward. And then the internal dynamics of the situation will begin to put greater and greater constraints on the regime's ability to behave in such an unaccountable and destructive way.
Okay, Dr. Kim.
Thank you, Marcus. I'm Julian Kim of the Research Institute. I have two short questions. First one is, in your research, you say the rising ratio of corruptions in North Korea. So how do you interpret the rising corruption and between the rising corruption and instability of the regimes? And second one is, as you are hesitating to comment on the Korean government strategy against North Korea, so it may be easy for you to comment on the American evaluation about the American strategy against North Korea, so-called strategic endurance of Obama government. So how do you evaluate about the strategic endurance of North Korea against North Korea?
Okay, let me take the questions in reverse order. I'm more comfortable describing American policy and analyzing that than South Korea's policy. Here's my very short, kind of crude encapsulation of U.S. policy towards North Korea. When President Obama was elected, in his inaugural address, and I was one of the million people packed on the mall listening to him, He stuck out his hand to North Korea. And North Korea's response was within weeks to engage in a nuclear test and missile tests. So President Obama came into office facing the worst economic crisis in the United States since the Great Depression, having to manage 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that had been bequeathed to him by his predecessor. He sticks out his hand to North Korea and they slap him. Well, if you're in his situation, are you going to spend much time trying to deal with the North Koreans? No. You're going to turn to other issues. Now we have this policy of strategic patience, and people are becoming impatient with the policy of strategic patience. There are specifically being calls for us to have direct talks with the North Koreans. Senator Kerry yesterday in the Los Angeles Times had an op-ed saying we should do this. Fine. It's always good to talk to people. I don't see how you can be hurt by talking to someone. But I think we need to recognize the political context in the United States has changed. The political context we face today is very much like the one in 1995. Why is that? October 1994, the United States and North Korea signed the agreed framework. The following month, in November 1994, the Republican Party, the opposition party, won the congressional elections and took control of the Congress. The following year, 1995 and 1996, in the run-up to the November 1996 presidential elections, the Republicans in Congress used the North Korean issue as a cudgel to just beat the Clinton administration. So now we face a situation in which, in the last congressional elections last year, the Republicans took control of the House of Representatives. Obama is going into a presidential election next year. He is going to be very reluctant to go out on a limb or risk any political capital for the North Koreans because he knows anything he does will be attacked by the Republicans in Congress. Even something as simple as providing humanitarian aid. Congressmen are already attacking the possibility that the United States would provide food aid to North Korea. So I think that basically, as I said earlier, because of the political situation here in South Korea, because of this political situation in the United States, and because of the succession issue in North Korea, I think it's very unlikely to see any major breakthroughs over the next several years. Now, on the issue of increasing corruption, excuse me, corruption acts as a kind of safety valve. You don't have to pay your policemen or your local officials a full salary because they're out extracting bribes from the local population. Okay, so it's a kind of safety valve. But it also means that the centrally organized political agenda and the parochial interest of the agents and officials that you expect to carry it out may begin to diverge. And I'll give you a very simple illustration. North Hamgyong is kind of the rust belt of North Korea. The economy is very depressed. And because of its location and the relative narrowness of the Tumen River, it is relatively easy to get out of North Korea from North Hamgyong. And former residents of North Hamgyong make up a substantial share of the North Korean refugees in China, as well as those that have reached South Korea. Remittances from those people back to North Hamgyong is now a significant share of the economy in North Hamgyong. Now, unauthorized exit from North Korea is illegal in the North Korean legal code. Coming to South Korea is traitorous, and your family should be incarcerated in the political prison system, the Kwanli-so. What I understand anecdotally is nowadays in North Hamgyong, the agent comes to your house. He says, "Brother Nam, I understand that your brother is now in South Korea. And I understand that he's sending money home to you. If you are willing to share, everything is okay." And so the shakedowns, I understand that, first of all, because increased policing of the border, the transaction cost of sending money from South Korea to North Hamgyong has really gone up. But that 50% of it is now being creamed off by the officials in North Hamgyong But on the other hand, the people don't go to the gulag. So this is an illustration about where the central government may actually want those people to go to the gulag, but the local officials are making money off of this kind of corruption. So it acts as a safety valve, but it also creates a fraying of the actual instruments of control, and that could not make the central government very comfortable. One of the things that we observe in North Korea's economic relationship with China is an increasing attempt to centralize it, in part on the Chinese side, to get around the issue of every North Korean sticking their hand out for corruption when the Chinese go into North Korea to do business. But at the same time, by centralizing it, you centralize the corruption, and if you look at the membership of these committees, it's basically a map to the internal political economy of North Korea, because you see who is influential and which groups are influential and which groups are going to be able to extract the money from the Chinese investors coming in.
Okay. Yeah.
Alan Tillett from Seoul Global Center. The North Korean regime gets into, well, it gets very excited. The propaganda gets into overdrive every time the conservative groups in South Korea send balloons over with propaganda, whatever you can call it, or information, leaflets, dollar bills, and so on. In your surveys, did you find that this spreading of information had any effect at all? And what's your personal opinion? Do you think it's a good idea to flood North Korea with open information and pamphlets?
On the first part of your question, no. We did not really explore that. And I think you would have to do more recent surveys when that activity increased, right? I mean, that, in a historical sense, that activity is quite recent. And a lot of these people left in 2005 or 2003 or 1999, so they were not exposed to that kind of thing. On whether it is a good idea or not, I think that in general, I think more information the better. And I think that I was quite surprised when I looked at some of these tracts that these groups are sending using the balloons. I was actually surprised by their political sophistication. I expected really crude anti-regime propaganda. And obviously the people who are doing this are quite opposed to the regime. But I remember, and on our blog, we actually reproduced one of these pamphlets. And you can go read it. It is basically a short history of the Korean Peninsula over the last 60 years. And I thought it was actually a pretty fair rendering of how different groups have behaved, and it put the Kim family and that regime into a certain political context. And what I understand is really drove the North Koreans completely apoplectic was the descriptions of Kim Jong-il's personal life and the fact that he had had multiple consorts and had children by a variety of women, and they had a kind of family tree. And it was my understanding that it was that personal information that just sent the North Koreans crazy. I think there's room for providing, as I said, really fairly neutral information that would not necessarily be attacking the regime, but I think would be of interest to North Korean people and probably be constructive in terms of North Korea. I mean, if the North Korean people could simply read, and let's not pick an American or a South Korean newspaper. Let's say the North Koreans could just read, I don't know, the London Times, or Le Monde, or El País, and just read it. Translated into Korean, I suppose. What's going on in the world? What's happening in Libya? I think that would be useful. Just knowing prices, for example. Knowing what the price of wheat is today in various places. Knowing about the weather. I think there are lots of things that can be provided to the North Koreans that are not anti-regime propaganda that would actually have a very constructive role. So I guess my ultimate bottom line in all this is that I understand why people are uncomfortable or made uncomfortable by the activities of some of these groups. But if it's a private group and you're sending this stuff, I think one should err on the side of not controlling this activity. Likewise, if private groups want to provide humanitarian aid to North Korea, I think one should err on the side of not interfering with that. It's private groups doing things with their own resources, and I would have a relatively light hand.
Hi, my name is Kim Ji, and I'm a reporter from Ariang TV. I have 3 questions for you. Is it correct to say that all forms of market transactions at the individual level are banned in theory in North Korea, but the government is currently not being consistent with their market regulation, like in case of the elites involved in market activities behind the scenes? And then my second question is, if North Koreans had access to information and civil institutions, like you said, do you think they can start off something like the Jasmine Revolution?
Jasmine Revolution, no. The nature of North Korea, because of the absence of the civil society institutions and the proliferation of security agencies and armed groups, the fact that North Korea is the most militarized society on earth, and virtually every male has military training, means that if there is an abrupt political change in North Korea, it is less likely to look like the Jasmine Revolution, or less likely to look like the collapse of East Germany, which if I were a South Korean, I would go to bed every night praying for, and more like Romania on steroids. That this will be bloody, there will be people shooting people in the streets. These variety of these security and military agencies will be settling scores with each other. So I see, if there's abrupt change, intra-elite fighting playing an important role. And that's why when I come to South Korea, I know it's a thing with South Koreans, but I look at the East German case, and I look at the potential outcomes in North Korea, and I'm thinking, boy, East Germany looks really good to me. There was no mass violence. Nobody got hurt. There were no loose nukes. If you could get that outcome, like I said, I would pray for it. But I think the actual outcome, if there is abrupt change, is likely to be much bloodier. And the real risk, of course, is that one or more factions will appeal to either South Korea or China for support. And the introduction of foreign forces into that kind of situation could really raise the stakes. So I think that eventually we'll get to unification, but I think it may well be a very bumpy road. Finally, on regulations, North Koreans have all sorts of regulations on market activities. I mean, one of the interesting things about looking at the North Korean legal code is to look how it evolves. So and it implicitly tells you that things are going on. For example, one of the questions that didn't come up today was, how can we believe what these people are saying about the abuses they say they witnessed in the prison system? Aren't they just telling us what they think we want to hear? We're very concerned about that. So when we did our analysis, we asked a hierarchy of questions. We asked the prisoners, when you were in prison, did you see prisoners being beaten? And the affirmative response rate was almost 100%. And my guess is, if you went to a local prison here in South Korea, or if you went to the DC city jail and you ask the prisoners there, have you ever seen a prisoner beaten? Probably a lot of them would say yes. My guess is you could probably go to almost any prison anywhere in the world and ask, have you ever seen a prisoner beaten? And lots of prisoners will say yes. Then we asked, had you ever seen a public execution? And a disturbing number of the prisoners responded affirmatively, but it was a much lower number. It was maybe 50%. And we went through these various forms of abuse till finally we got to the issue of forced abortions and infanticide practiced against women who were pregnant at the time they were repatriated from China. In the China survey, the share of people who said they had first-hand knowledge of this was 6%. Much, much lower, as one would expect. And when we did it in the South Korea survey, the share of respondents saying they had firsthand knowledge of this phenomenon was 7%. So you had both within the hierarchy of abuses a plausible pattern of narrowing, and you had the numbers lining up from two surveys, which lead one to believe that maybe this is really, something is really happening. Then we observed that in the North Korean legal system, they made forced abortion and infanticide on these women illegal. Now, it is allegedly continuing to occur, but you could observe the fact that this was now made a crime in the legal code, which suggests that implicitly it must have been going on. So we can see, if we look at the legal code, all sorts of things in the market now being made illegal. Selling precious metals, right? Well, somebody must have been doing it if they made it illegal to do so. The one that I find amusing, actually I shouldn't say I find it amusing, but the one I find curious is that in one legal code change, they made operating a prostitution ring out of a restaurant or hotel a crime. And the subsequent revision, they made it a capital crime. You can now be executed for pimping in North Korea. This may be a good or bad thing. I will leave that up to you to decide.
Okay. The time has already gone too far. It's over 9 o'clock, and I think unless you have very urgent question, I think I'd like to stop here for this morning session. I really thank to Marcus Noland for very lengthy speeches and Q&A session, and I really appreciate also from the floor to cooperate and very active participations. And I hope we can have Marcus Noland not too far away sometime when you happen to have a chance to come to Seoul, or we can make an arrangement because people's fever is very high here to to call you again, I think. So thank you very much for participation.